Okay, so let's continue. We're gonna continue with the nutrients. We're still in the macronutrients, and so we're gonna continue with that. So here's sulfur deficiency. Again, I think I showed this before we left for the break, right? Again, in rural areas, the sulfur deficiency came up more because of lack of pollution. The sulfur that was in the air. Pittsburgh never has sulfur deficiency. I go back there and I can still smell, even though there's not as many steel mills, we say steel mills. There's still sulfur in the air, you can smell it. So here's more sulfur. Does this have a pointer too?
It won't work on the screen though.
Wow, okay. Okay, so here you can see the younger leaves, yellow, and then the older leaves get a little greener. So usually it does show up on the youngest growth burst. And here's sulfur. You can see, unlike nitrogen and stuff, it's more, there's yellowing on almost the whole plant, oftentimes, when it happens. Here's sulfur deficiency on sorghum. Can you kind of see that? The new growth is a little yellower than, so nitrogen, it would be down here, no problem. You would see that right away. So I don't think we're gonna run into sulfur issues here. And then here's potassium, no potato, no sulfur and sulfur. So you see there's even some stunting here as well. And some of the tropicals, you see some of the yellowing of the leaves. And so sometimes you have to be careful. Sometimes you have an environmental issue with some of these things because that almost looks like sunburn, right? Or lack of water. Sometimes some of our tropicals, I know I'm guilty of having that problem, not watering enough. Right now I'm trying to save on the water. And so some of my Scheffeleras will actually have that chlorosis, and the chlorophyll is breaking down on that new growth. So also keep that in mind. You know, I know I'm plant nutrition and it's how I'm wired, but you have to think about everything else, the environmental part, and also the time of the year. If you're growing things outside, I can go on a little side here if we have time. The sun angle is really important when you're looking at your plants and how they're performing and what's going on. So we've had a couple heat spikes here. About 4 years ago, we had one that was 118 and 121, I think, in Northridge, the hottest it's ever been. And then we had, and that temperature spike, I think, was in July, and then there was another one, the temperature spike was in September. Okay, and there were differences and the damage to the plants. And the one in July, we had a lot of defoliation of some of the temperate trees. They dropped all their leaves. So can anyone tell me, if you're looking at heat spikes, because this is unfortunately probably becoming part of our life. When you have heat spikes, there's things you have to remember. One, what time of the year is the heat spike occurring? And how long is the duration? But if you have a heat spike in July, early July, and you have a heat spike in later December and later September, what's different in those two different time periods?
Well, normally in July you have a longer day,
right?
And it seems that the sun's more direct.
Right. So the sun angle is going to have a big play in this. You hit both nails on the head. So you have duration of the heat spike in the day, the temperature, how long it's going to be sustained at that temperature, and the angle of the sun. What's really odd, I tell people this and they scratch their head, the sun is actually closest to the earth during our summers. In the southern hemisphere, of course, it's different, but in the northern hemisphere, the sun is actually closer to the earth during the northern hemisphere. I'm sorry, did I say that backwards? The sun is actually further away from us in the summer months for the northern hemisphere, and it's closer to the morning. Okay, but the angle of the sun is more important. So when we had the heat spikes, you would see in September, I noticed more damage on a different angle of the tree because the sun angle was a little bit different. And so I saw damage more at an angle, but when it's overhead, you have different damage. And so I noticed some of the palm trees, I don't know, but some of the palm trees that have, the crown shaft of some of the, like king palms and stuff, there seemed to be damage on that side of on the side of the tree rather than on the canopy top during the September months because the sun angle was lower. The other thing that you don't want to misunderstand when looking at this stuff is when we're driving around Southern California, we have so many climates. So you go from the coast to Palm Springs, and you look and you'll see, in Palm Springs, you'll see Phoenix robelinii growing, and it normally gets to 110, 114 in the summer. And on the coast, it almost never gets above 90. And so during those heat spikes, there was more damage to the robelinii on the coast than there was in Palm Springs. And why is that? Because they're used to it. The plants grew, it's normal down there. Things grow and gradually adapt as the leaves expand. And so the stomatal density and different things that we don't really understand, they adapt better. And so, in robelinii case, it can't. There are some plants that can't do that. I mean, if you grow, there's one called the shaving brush palm, which is from Lord Howe Island. It's a very cool island climate. I can't grow them in Riverside without them burning. Okay, they have to be in full shade. On the coast, they're in full sun. Or Kentia palms, everyone is from Kentias. So that's another one, right? It will never adapt. But robelinii seem to adapt pretty well to many different climates, which is why it's common, right? I mean, I struggle all the time with plants. I hate growing anything in my yard that everybody has. And so I try like the Dickens to grow something completely different. But then what do I end up in my yard? I have ligustrum for a hedge and wall. Why? Because it's adaptable. There's a reason why it's common. The thing can go through anything and it still works. So there's something to be said for that. Yes?
We've been told also with avocados that I think it's around the mid-80s that the stomata will shut down. So watering anytime after that doesn't do you a lot of good. And that we should, if we do have a forecast, that we need to hydrate the trees thoroughly at least 2 to 3 days before the event comes up. And then also they're looking a lot now at overhead cooling, if possible, for avocados, which is no easy feat, but because of supposedly the change, in the environment or whatever. And to be able to do that, they're thinking that perhaps with the overhead cooling, they can minimize some of the damage because a lot of those folks lost a year or two's worth of growth and their crop with that big event we had, 3 or 4 years ago.
Right. These are things that we really have to start thinking about. Those are really good points. And I'm going to give a talk in December at Long Beach, but talking about how do we prepare for this thing. And we're in a drought, and we're supposed to have the water levels at a certain level, and the plants aren't ready, and so you'll get burned. Another thing is a lot of cultural management practices. A lot of people, they have to have trunk clearance, 6 foot of trunk, and for a tree, for different regulations in the environment. But a lot of trees grow in forests, and they're shaded. The trunks are shaded. And now we're growing them in landscapes, and they're reflecting heat off of the pavement, and you have the trunk, and you get trunk burn. And when you get trunk burn, you start losing trees. There's no going back on that. If it's severe enough, and if there's not enough water going up into that canopy through that trunk, it will burn, and it will split. And we know that. A lot of commercial orchards know that. Citrus, they will spray them white or do a whitewash or something to keep them from burning, to cool the temperature off a little bit. And even in nursery production, leaves are on the trunks when they train them to standards, but they keep the leaves on or keep them close in rows so they don't get that burning. Because once the trunk burns, you damage the phloem, and you will see parts of the tree, especially a larger tree, you'll see one part starting to die and the other part won't, because the xylem and the phloem are functional on one side and they've been compromised on the other. And so you might see where those are leading to on the tree, you'll see some dieback. So yeah, those are really good points, and these are things we're going to have to change, and we're going to have to learn to adapt. We love to clean palm trees of their lower leaves, and those lower leaves kind of protect the crown and protect some of the trunk of some of those plant species. And I think one of the reasons, this is a side, that why royal palms do a little better in the heat, you'll see those in Palm Springs, is they have a lower canopy. And so king palms tend to be more upright, and the crown shaft isn't as protected in the sun, and so they can get toasted, which can kill the meristem. And so we see that a lot. So yeah, so there's a lot of cultural things we can do to help deal with these issues that we're going to have to work with, right? Okay, so moving on. Okay. Am I going backwards? Okay, calcium. Let's talk about calcium. This is a good one to talk about. Calcium in the plant is required at 0.5 to 1.5%. Fertilizer types, many of us will use lime or gypsum or even dolomite. That's not in there. The calcium sulfate and magnesium sulfate. And so dolomite is another one. Calcium chloride. The chloride usually we stay away from. We increase our salts anymore. But calcium is not immobile in the plant. So when you have a calcium deficiency, it's going to be on the newer growth. The uptake is reduced because it's a positively charged ion by ammonium, then magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And here's something that's really important. Calcium, like all the nutrients, they're really dependent on the transpiration stream. And if you have an active water uptake and transpiration, you have active uptake of the nutrients, and they're going up into the plant and the growing points. This is one of the nice things about living in California. Our humidity is 20%, 30%. On the coast, it might be 70. But in the inland areas, our humidity is very low. And so when we have water and we water the plants, that transpiration rate is just going. And all those nutrients are taken up. And it's a great thing because it's basically the plants are eating, so to speak. They're getting the nutrients they need and they're growing actively. When you live in Florida and Georgia, Alabama, and the East Coast, the humidity is 50%, 60%. In Florida and the coastal plains, it starts off at 100% every morning in the summer. And then it goes down to about 60 or 50, and then it goes back up after the afternoon rain. So guess what? Transpiration rates are impacted by that because you don't have that evaporation from the plant. The other nice thing about our low humidity is what's another thing transpiration does for the plant and why watering is so important. What's the one thing that's important? In addition to nutrient uptake, what does transpiration do?
Cools the tree.
It cools the tree. Yeah. That evaporative cooling. This is why people, when you see dogs in the yards, in the lawns, real lawns, it's nice and cool. Tall fescue is nice and cool. Bermuda grass isn't as cool, I noticed. It's interesting. Lauren's done studies with stuff like this. So that cooling effect is really important, and it serves a purpose, right? When the plant starts overheating, then just like us, our pathways don't work. And when you run out of water, the plants can overheat. We're the same way. When we're sweating, we're cooling. We're cooling up. I'm lucky. I sweat. I have some friends. They're Asian. I don't know if there's a difference, but a couple of them, they don't sweat. And you think, oh, they're so lucky. But they overheat, and they can't handle the heat as well. A couple of my friends, I'm like, dude, we need to figure out how to get you to sweat. But he's always worried because he doesn't sweat. Most people, when you stop sweating, that's a very bad sign that you've run out of water and you're going to overheat, and your body's going to overheat when you stop sweating. Huh?
Have you tried giving your friends potassium supplements?
Oh yeah, they do the salts and everything. Yeah, right. Yeah, doing that. I'll have to tell them that. They'll probably scratch their head once again at me. Yeah, tell me more potassium. But people that do a lot of outside activities will have the salts, right? And people do that a lot. Lauren knows me on the other hand, I'm this vegetable person. I just graze all the time and I just eat so many vegetables to keep up with the fast rabbits, I say. So I have to eat a lot.
He thinks he can increase his stomatal density.
Yeah, So, but yeah, I should be green or orange for all the stuff that I eat. So going to that, so calcium is very interesting. Of all the nutrients, I think this one's the most unique, and it demonstrates this need for transpiration more so than the other nutrients. Calcium, if you're in a greenhouse, calcium uptake is very dependent on transpiration. And calcium is important because it's laid down in the cell wall. But it's laid down in the cell wall when the cells are developing. So a good example, and I'll show you in a second, is fruit. If calcium is in your system and you have high humidity in your greenhouse or something, you're not going to get the calcium uptake that you need. Okay, so this is a problem in some of the cut flower production industry. It used to be with lilies. They would get calcium deficiency, and the way they mitigated that was not adding more calcium. It was to increase the air circulation in the greenhouse to get the humidity down. So it's very important that you have the calcium there. I keep going backwards. I don't like this button thing. Okay, so cell wall integrity, cell membrane integrity, and cell expansion through osmotic effect in the vacuoles. So calcium deficiency is going to show up on the new growth. I'm trying to not jump ahead with the stories. So here's calcium deficiency. Chlorotic to form younger leaves, right? Why? Because the cells broke down, okay? Here's a tomato. This is a perfect example. This is blossom end rot. I think everyone's seen this, okay? Apples have bitter pit. I've only seen bitter pit apples in the store once and I was excited and took a photo. So what's he doing? But, so here's blossom end rot. Now this is interesting because you get this nice big tomato and you have blossom end rot. So when did the calcium deficiency occur? When did you not have, what happened? Like there's a time thing in here now, right? You're talking about water availability ahead of schedule, like understanding climate so that we know when the heat spike is going to come and you get the plants ready. So with this example here, the calcium deficiency didn't occur like that week when that fruit was there. It happened in the very beginning after the flower was fertilized and you had cell division. And you had cells being laid down for the tomato fruit when it was young. There was no calcium in those cells laid down. So basically you had a calcium deficient cell. And as the cell started to expand in the later part of the plant's life, the fruit life, the cells collapsed. Kind of like rebar, right? If you don't have the rebar to hold things together, boom, you're done. So during cell division, when the cells were small, you didn't see any symptoms. But after the cells started expanding about 4 weeks later, that's when the deficiency symptoms occurred. But the problem occurred a month earlier. And so there's a time thing here. And with calcium, it can be either humidity, or it can be the improper irrigation, not having a uniform availability of water during flowering and flower fertilization when fruit set is occurring. Okay, so there's a timing thing here. So you have to think about that when you're looking at some of these deficiency symptoms, especially for calcium. When did this occur? It didn't occur today. It occurred 4 weeks ago. What did I do that I shouldn't have done? Or what could I have done to prevent this from happening? And so in some industries, in crop production, this is a problem. And they have to work their way around it, right? And so what are some things they could do to prevent this from happening? Like in breeding, what could you do? Think about it. If you have to worry about transpiration, if that's part of the equation. So if you're breeding for tomatoes, for example, if you have tomatoes that have fruit set towards the outside of the canopy, there's going to be lower humidity. And so there's going to be better opportunities for the calcium to be laid down into that developing fruit if they're on the outside of the canopy rather than inside the canopy, right? But what's negative with that? sunburn. So when you're dealing with like avocados, for example, you have some of these cultivars. I think Gem is now becoming that one, where Gem tends to set more fruit in the canopy. Reed does the same thing, I think. And so it protects them from sunburn. So that's a nice thing to have, right? You can't find them, but it helps them protect them from sunburn. So these are things we always have to think about when we're developing things. Yes?
There's some growers that are using clonal rootstocks with tomatoes too. I've seen them graft them for a variety of reasons, but if you had one that was particularly good on pulling calcium, because calcium tends to get tied up in many soils, that might be an advantage too.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's worth it though. It might be
Yeah.
very expensive.
Well, traditional breeding and grafting is becoming taken backseat, I think, to a lot of research, and I get frustrated by that because there's so many opportunities for rootstocks to help with some of these issues in like disease, which if I talked about what it did for avocados, and what's the watermelon disease out in the desert? Is it a rhizoctonia or something? They actually graft watermelons, you know? I mean, you know, so they use it to prevent this disease because they have this disease because of rootstocks. Lauren, do you know what the desert, they graft watermelons. Stangalini worked on this, I think. What was that one disease? It was like bullet or some sort of root disease out there. And they graft watermelons. So yeah, so they can do that for disease management as well. So look at the time part of things. You know, they have green beans. We did a research project looking at green beans. And the weird thing was, in Houston, we were growing crops with heavy isotopes of calcium. Calcium. And so we were looking at calcium absorption in humans by growing green beans that were labeled with heavy isotopes of calcium. So they're not radioisotopes because it was one extra neutron, not an extra electron. So it wasn't radioactive. So, but they could trace it in humans. I didn't do this, thank God, because you can only, I won't tell you how they did it. But we had two cultivars of green beans, and the one green bean grew on the outer side of the canopy, and the other green bean was more inside the canopy. And so the ones that were on the inside of the canopy had lower calcium concentrations than the ones on the outer part of the canopy, the other cultivar. So things like that can really help. But it also helps you understand how this works. So calcium, very important on transpiration. And now we've thrown time into the equation, right? When you're looking at crop production. So this is why it's good to keep records as well, right? Keeping records of what you're doing. The other thing, calcium deficiencies causes tip dieback, so you get a stunting of the roots. So you don't have a very good root system. And so it can't take up other nutrients. So then we start adding other nutrient deficiencies into the equation, which can be really a problem. Blueberry, calcium deficiency, chlorosis of the new growth. Here's the bitter pit in apple. And so what happens is you get the collapse of the tissue as it expands later on in the apple's development stage. It's not in the young stage when the cells are dividing. It's when the cells start expanding and the cell walls collapse and you get the bitter pit. I've only seen that once in the grocery store. I forget what variety it was, but it was really beautiful in terms of the deficiencies. So, and I was surprised they were selling them, but it was what it was. So that's bitter pit and apple. They're still good. They still taste good. So, okay. And then wilting on the young growth with potato. So let's talk about magnesium. So magnesium is also an element like calcium. It's a positively charged element. It has two charges, positive charges per ion, just like calcium. And magnesium, 0.15 to 0.4%. Calcium magnesium ratio is usually 2:1 with fertilizers. And then K potassium to magnesium ratio, 8:1 in the plant, I mean. And the fertilizer types, magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts. Okay, Epsom salts are nice. See all those water molecules there? It's very water soluble. So magnesium, a lot of this molecule is actually water. So it solubilizes readily in water. Dolomite is a good way to get magnesium when you're looking at container production. Really fun. And it's very mobile in the plant. And it's reduced by, if you have too much potassium, ammonium, calcium, or sodium in that order. And then again, leached sandy soils are going to be a problem with magnesium deficiency, and then acid soils. And then actually, back in the early 19th century, magnesium deficiency was referred to as soil drowning, soil drowning, because after heavy rains, it leached all the magnesium out of the tobacco fields, and so tobacco would show up with magnesium deficiency. Magnesium, if you remember back in the beginning of the talk today, is a macronutrient. It's required in higher amounts. And so, but a lot of fertilizer types don't have magnesium in them. And so sometimes this can be a problem with certain plants, especially some of the tropicals. So here's magnesium deficiency. You get a Christmas tree pattern chlorosis. So unlike nitrogen, remember nitrogen was a uniform yellowing, right? On the oldest leaves. Can you see the pattern of magnesium deficiency? It's on the outer part of the leaf first. It starts to break down like this, and you'll have actually the veins of the leaves will stay green, and the intervenal veins will become yellow. So you have this intervenal chlorosis. With nitrogen deficiency, the entire leaf will turn yellow. So that's how you can tell the difference. If you look at these chrysanthemums, these are great symptoms right here, right? Wonderful. But they're flowering, right? This is a cut flower crop. So would you recommend a grower to put magnesium down for this right now? No, because he's going to harvest, or she's going to harvest the flowers. So they're done anyway. But that's a classic magnesium deficiency symptom. Palm trees are notorious for this. Phoenix palms, I see some of it out in the desert, Phoenix dactylifera, the dates. I've seen some of it in Canariensis. I was talking, what's your first name again?
David.
David, talking to David earlier. We're both palm crazy people, so, whatever. But, so magnesium deficiency is really common in the Phoenix, and reclinata is one of the ones that it just is horrible. And what people do in the landscape industry is like, oh yeah, these oldest fronds are starting to get yellow. They cut them off, and they're not trying to fix the problem. So what they're doing is, what are they doing? They're taking out the last resource for magnesium in the tree, which is the oldest leaves. So now it's even worse, right? There's nothing in the soil, or the soil can't take it up, something in the roots. And now they're removing the last reserve of magnesium, which is in the oldest leaves. So they're making the system worse. So this has to be corrected. And as I mentioned earlier with micronutrients and the new growth, you can do chelate sprays and stuff to help mitigate and correct that deficiency symptom until you get the soil corrected. But with something like this, you can't. If it gets to a point where it's this yellow, it's not going to recover. So you're never going to recover those leaves. But if you add the fertilizer, the new growth will be better. So yeah, spraying it on there is not going to fix that. That's one of the things you can't do. Same with nitrogen. Once those leaves turn yellow, they're going to turn yellow. With micronutrients, you can get the spray on there and it'll be better. In the citrus industry, they know, many growers know that magnesium deficiency can be a problem, and they'll apply Epsom salts or magnesium of some sort early in the spring before the new growth even occurs, because they know it's coming, or they'll spray the trees, because that seems to be a problem that occurs probably in some cultivars and not others. It can be very cultivar specific. So with this one, with palm trees, palm specials, you wonder why there's different fertilizer types. So for whatever reason why palm trees have these deficiency symptoms and why they're so susceptible, we're not always sure. But they make palm special fertilizers that have magnesium. They have more magnesium in them than typical fertilizers. So you'll see some of the palm specials will have 2% magnesium in them to help mitigate some of that. So magnesium is one of those classic ones, probably one of the macronutrients I see the most of in terms of nutrient deficiencies. So any questions on that one? No? If you're in a greenhouse, with calcium deficiency, you have to start thinking about that as well. they're starting to grow a lot of the citrus material that has to be quarantined. And they have to be in enclosed structures to keep out the citrus psyllid. What is it? The ACP. And so they're in the greenhouse. Well, guess what? The humidity is higher in the greenhouse. So now this whole production process has to be questioned and how we're going to deal with this in terms of the humidity and stuff with some of these. And some cultivars are going to show symptoms of some nutrient disorders and some aren't. They're going to be adaptable. All things we have to learn as we go. So now let's talk about the micronutrients. And I talked about the micronutrients before: iron, manganese, copper, boron, zinc, molybdenum, chlorine, nickel. So fertilizer management cuts back the zone of most clutter of chemicals nicely. So most people like boron. Boron is all over the map in this state, I've learned, because I'm not from here. But Portland has problems with boron toxicity up where he lives, and they get boron toxicity. Lauren, I'm going to bother you for a second. So because you know about boron toxicity in Sacramento, and you've told me the story about how things leaf out in the spring and how it changes. Can you share that with us?
Sure. So I used to teach a plant disorders class, and boron in Davis. Davis is known for high boron in the water. And there's this Nyssa sylvatica tubular tree out on the corner of the department. And in the spring it would leaf out, look great, but when the temperature started increasing and more water irrigation, this nice dark edge of the leaf would show up, and it was just classic boron symptoms. This dark brown with a black line on the inside of the leaf was just classic boron symptoms. It was really reliable.
So it was a timing thing too, in terms of the plant, not only timing in terms of the season, but also the stage of development of the plant. So.
And early in the spring, it's getting water from the spring. Well, the winter rains when we normally have those. Later in the summer, late spring is more irrigation with that high boron water, so you'll show it every year.
Yeah, so interesting. Yeah. But in the southern part of the state, in many parts we have boron deficiencies. But if you go up to Piru, which is off the 126, they have boron toxicity. So I don't like to talk about it because it's all over the map, and I haven't pulled the map out to see what regions are hot and what regions are not in terms of boron. Yeah, but it's really quite unique,
In some greenhouse crops, we used to grow poinsettias, well, and other stuff, but in our liquid feed programs, we would have to put boric acid in it because it was really low boron.
Yeah. So it's really region specific. So it's important to know these things. So, okay, so let's move on and talk about these deficiency symptoms. So iron, of all the micronutrients, iron is required in the highest amount, and it's 50 to 75 parts per million, which is really low. And then the phosphorus iron ratio in the plant is usually 29:1. That's the region you look for. So one of the things that I'll talk about lab reports later this afternoon, but in terms of looking at the concentration of nutrients or even your blood work, is that it's not always about just the concentration or the concentration of that particular element in the plant. It's also about its concentration in relation to the other elements on that tissue report. Like I was saying, there's competition, and so you can have induced deficiency symptoms because of toxicity of another element. So, and many labs will not always report that and get into that kind of detail. Fertilizer types: iron sulfates, iron chloride, and iron chelates. We're going to talk about chelates too, and this afternoon, and what chelates are, how they work. They're expensive, why they're expensive, but why they work. And then the functions in the plant: enzyme reactions, oxidation, reduction, nitrate reduction. Iron is involved in nitrate assimilation and photosynthesis. Iron, since we have soils people here that are growing things in the soil, gesundheit, is Iron is usually precipitated out of the soil in solid form and high pH. And so if we have high pH soils, which many of us do, the iron is hard to get to. Poor drainage. Again, that's just poor root system development. You don't get the iron uptake. And then nitrate, high pH reduces iron. So if you're using a lot of nitrate as your predominant nitrogen form, then the pH can go up and iron can precipitate out. And again, even if you're using some ammonium, you get nitrification, you may still get a higher pH. But I think everybody is comfortable with iron deficiency symptoms, and unfortunately seen it here in this area. But you see the new growth is chloride, and you got that intervenal thing going on. If this was a notice leaves, you'd think, oh, okay, that's magnesium, right? But with iron, it's in the new growth. And this is actually not so bad. I mean, these leaves are actually normal. And if you were to get the iron to the leaves, you would actually get a normal development on the leaf. The leaf wouldn't be distorted. In severe cases, it can be distorted. Here's iron in citrus from the oldest, from adequate iron to iron deficient in the newer leaves. You can see the veins are still green, very evident here. You can't confuse this with magnesium deficiency. One, because of the location on the plant where it starts, but two, look at the veins, how green those are. With magnesium, you'd have a little bit of intervenal greening towards the petiole. In sorghum, because the veination is parallel, you get that intervenal chlorosis in a parallel pattern on the new growth. Here's avocado, iron chlorosis, none, slight, medium, and severe. And again, this is the new growth, right? So you can fix some of these things with sprays. But with avocado and some of the other leafier things, they get very waxy, right? The leaves get hard, paper. And in order to correct these deficiency symptoms, you have to get it on there when the leaves can absorb the iron. And once they get mature, they don't absorb things very well because they have that waxy coating and it won't sink in. Okay, manganese. Manganese is more of a problem in the southeast, but the average amount is 10 to 40 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million. Fertilizer types, magnesium sulfate, chlorides, just like the iron, and then chelates. Plant functions, okay, also an enzyme activator and energy transfer. Again, high pH, poor drainage, and even acid soils can cause toxicity. But this is more of, I've only seen this problem in the southeast with certain palms, and haven't seen it much here. What happens is you'll see, I'll show symptoms. You get this, basically what happens with palms in Florida is that it gets chilly in the wintertime, and the soils will cool off a little bit. And so the roots aren't growing, and so the new plant material comes out, and since the manganese has already been laid down when those leaves were just developing, when they start to expand, you have this collapse. So you get manganese deficiency in those palms. And that, of course, cannot be corrected, but the newer growth, as it grows out and the soils warm up and manganese uptake is occurring, then you get normal canopy development. But this first group of leaves is going to be damaged.
Is that why you see out in the low desert Palm Spring area, people try and grow queen palms and they get frizzle top or whatever you call that?
I think with queen palms, everyone keeps asking me this question. So when you go from banning down to the desert, you see the change, right?
Sure, right.
And I was thinking the soil, and people have tried. And so I go down there a lot in the wintertime when I get tired of the fog. And what I've noticed is that if the summers are mild and not so hot down there, the next year the queen palms look half decent. Only half decent, but still wouldn't plant one in my yard. And I think what it is this heat damage in the meristem the previous summer.
So, yeah, it's more of that.
I don't believe that it's anything else. And when I see queen palms on the coast, versus even into Riverside. I mean, there are exceptions, right? There's variations in this, they're all sequent. The trunks are even bigger. And when you get towards the hotter climates, they just aren't thriving at all. And you know, it's even funny in Florida, we've talked about this, my palm friends, that the queen palms, the trunks aren't nearly as massive as they are on our coasts. It's almost like there's a different seed source for the palm species. And I think they just like it cooler and they just develop better. I mean, you have Jubea, chilensis also is another one. And they have a hard time in Florida. And it's not cold tolerance. It's just, it's too warm, I think, and the plants can't develop properly. But I think out in the desert, this is just my theory. It's how hot it was the summer before. And when those new leaves come out, they become distorted. The other reason I think that's the case is because during the heat spikes that we had, those 2 heat spikes we had in the past 8 years, I've even noticed it here with the queens. That the new fronds, and it was funny, it was the southwest side of the canopy, always, that new leaf came out and it was just yellow and weird. It's like, why did that happen? Now, last year we had 118. I could be totally wrong, but I've seen it so many times. And
yeah, it makes sense.
It's just crazy. And I'm like, wow, that's weird. You know, it's just the one side of the tree, it's always oriented a certain way. And the king palms that were damaged, king palms had really a hard time with this. I had king palms in Rancho Cucamonga, in the other house, and they did really well. And actually they're still doing really well because they're on the north side of the house, so they're protected from the southwestern sun. But we have lost so many king palms in that heat wave in the Inland Empire, it's just sickening. And I would have planted them in my new yard, and I didn't because of that reason. The only ones I would plant, there's one that has a canopy that wilts, that kind of droops. Have you seen it?
A recurve?
Huh?
A recurve?
Kind of recurve. And I've seen maybe 4 of them. And I've tried to collect seeds from one. But I'm like, wow, that would be really cool to have, because if the fronds are curved over the crown shaft a little more, it would probably protect it from that hot angle of the sun in the summer. And that one might do better than ones where the canopy is held upright.
Right.
You know, Cunninghamania droops a little bit. Alexandrina droops a little more. So, yeah, so it's just things going
I
on.
wanted to talk like, Milo-ensis also it's more.
Right, yeah, so there's these things, you look at characteristics and stuff, so anyway. So, manganese deficiency avocado, you can see there's a very weird, and I'm not an avocado expert, so I have never seen this in avocado. So, but that, and I'm not sure why physiologically that one's occurring that way. And tomato, you get the necrosis and the breakdown in the leaves. But it's in the new leaves, so here, that's why you would see that. So that's not magnesium, it's manganese. So. Copper's another one I don't think you're ever gonna run across. Copper 3 to 20 parts per million. It's in fungicides, as is sulfur, right? We have sulfur in some of our chemicals. And then plant functions, lignification of cell walls, carbohydrate transport, and pollen viability. So sometimes pollen viability is impacted, then you don't get proper fruit set. And you can see here in citrus gum pockets, I've never seen this, mimosis, dieback, maybe, have you seen any of this? Maybe the diagnosis of that, I'm not a citrus person. And then barley is called pigtailing, have you ever seen that? Angolemia, leaf curling. And if I've seen that, I didn't notice it as copper deficiency in some of the tropicals. So, and then sugar beet, you get a blanching of the leaves. So that's copper deficiency, but I haven't run across it at all. The other thing is copper. One thing I want to point out with copper, though, is copper is an essential element, and it's required in certain amounts. But there are some systems of water treatment where they're injecting copper into the water to treat for the algae and stuff. And so I'm not saying don't do that, but you have to understand that copper is an essential nutrient and you can't accumulate toxic levels. But I've seen it used in certain cases for keeping algae out of the water. And I think even in cooling pads too, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, boron. Boron's that one we were talking about, Lauren talked about earlier. The boron is required, about 20 parts per million. Borax, soluble in boric acid. I've used borax for my one palm because I stand up here and talk like I know everything, but I don't. Because I have gray hair armada at home, it's a palm, and it has classic boron deficiency symptoms, and it's driving me crazy. Because I think our water quality changes throughout the year where I live. We have well water in our region, and we have surface water. And when we get the groundwater, I think the quality of the water changes, and I get boron deficiency symptoms on the new leaves at a certain time of the year. And I think it happens about 6 months before, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So I'm still learning too, so I don't know everything, in case you haven't figured that out by now. Plant functions, cell wall synthesis, plasma membrane integrity, root elongation, pollen viability, and boron deficiency reduces phosphorus uptake, and calcium reduces boron toxicity. And why would I throw that in there? Because there are some regions of this state where boron toxicity is a problem. It's a problem with avocados in certain places because they don't get good fruit set. They have boron toxicity. How do you mitigate boron toxicity when it's in your water? You know, and so you have to figure out ways, changing the ratios of other fertilizers, maybe upping the nitrogen so that toxicity symptom is lessened. And some people will do that to help with the boron toxicity. It's up in Peru, I think is where I noticed we had one grower that had boron toxicity from that one region. So boron is more a problem in many places in the state because of toxicity. Here's boron deficiency though. Apple, you get stem necrosis for all your apple growers. Great fruit set. If you don't have enough boron, you get poor seed set, and you get boron deficiency symptoms there. Strawberry. This is a classic symptom of boron deficiency in strawberries. So you don't get proper seed set, and so you don't get proper fruit development. And then clubroot or splitting, stunting. So when you end up with something like this, then you end up with nutrient deficiencies of other things as well. Because look at this root. The enzyme processes, root hairs are all impaired by this. And so you have really a headache. And that becomes really a big problem because you get a plant that shows everything. And it's like, what is it? Is it, you can't pick it out what the problem is. And you have to try to troubleshoot. And you send the leaf sample in, and it shows up everything's deficient. And now you got to figure out what's happening. And it's probably, you know, and it's something in the root system, you know. I mean, and it's a learning experience. You know, you've been growing your avocados for 5 years. You've taken over the products, and so it's about experience, you know. I mean, I look at camphor trees here in California in the wintertime. You know, camphors and María, beautiful tree. But in the fall, those leaves turn yellow, and it just drives me bananas because I'm like, why is the chlorophyll breaking down in the fall? They hang on to the tree. It just looks funny. And then they go through these cycles, you know, and I'm always trying to figure out, is it the roots? Is it the canopy? What's going on? You know, what kind of temperature variations from year to year? Like we have the heat spikes, we have a cold winter. I'm beginning to figure out what those are. You know, we have these different winters now, and so now we have to figure out what's going on. But we had camphor trees in Florida, and they would do the same thing. It got chilly when we were in Florida, so they would get damaged by that, the cool temperatures. Zinc. Zinc is another one, another micronutrient, 15 to 50 milligrams parts per million. Zinc sulfate, zinc nitrate, zinc chelates. Enzyme activity, again, many of these micronutrients are involved in enzyme activity and way things function. And so that's why many times you get these deformities in the new growth. It's not a structural thing, so to speak, with regards to calcium, where you're laying down the cell wall and you have structural integrity compromised. With these, it's actually physiological mechanisms occurring where the cells are not functioning properly, and so you get breakdown of the cells in that. Phosphorus can reduce zinc uptake, and zinc reduces iron uptake, manganese uptake. But what's interesting about most of this is that a lot of micronutrients come as packages of chelates of the whole group. Because if you go overboard on one, you reduce deficiencies of the others. And if you really don't know what you're doing, you're going to cause more problems than correcting. So here's zinc deficiency, the rosetting of some of the new growth of plants, and then again, peach rosetting. So you get problems with cell division, and you get improper formation of the leaves. And so this almost looks like a disease, right? And so this is where we come in, and we should have the entomologist here with us, or the pathologist, rather than just me, and pointing out that, hey, you know, thrips and stuff can do that too. Because insects, weirdly enough, can, once you get an insect load in some of these new growth, insects like new growth because it's nice and succulent, easy to get to. And so they go in there and they feed, and they release their urine and whatever they release actually mimics some hormones. And so you got hormonal functions going on here that's mitigating and affecting growth. And so it's actually an insect infestation. So when I told you earlier that, oh yeah, look at the canopy, new growth is this way, then it's this. Well, it can also be insects, you know, for that, you know. But what stands out when you're looking at this stuff, especially with trees, is that you won't have all the branches doing the same thing. So if you have an insect infestation, you'll get one branch that may have that, rather than all of the new growth. So that's where you can troubleshoot with IPM and say, okay, this one's insect because nutrient deficiencies aren't going to show up that way. But insects will, you know, so you look at the canopy and you look at which part of the canopy it's on again, because insects, you know, don't care for heat either. So you look for those protected areas or inside the canopy when you see. Molybdenum, again, molybdenum is required in such small amounts, 0.15 to 0.3 parts per million, that it's almost never a problem. There's the molybdenum sources, molybdenum, as Ernest Bergman used to say. And it's important for nitrate reduction. That's one enzyme that it's involved with. And nitrogen fixing enzymes. So does everyone know about the nitrogen fixing plants? The legumes and stuff, so they're nitrogen fixers. Okay, so molybdenum is required for that. You also require bacteria that embeds into the plant. And so cistus is one of those plants that requires nitrogen fixing nodules. And if you don't have that in the plant, you don't get the nitrogen, you'll get a general yellowing. So you need to, if you're growing cistus, you should have that nitrogen fixing bacteria in your planting system. And most people do when they propagate. Culturally sandy and enriched acid soils again, but again, not here. I haven't seen it here. And here's molybdenum deficiency again, the yellowing of the new growth potato leaf on the left leaf. So you can see it's very, very subtle with some of these. And then African violet. So very seldom do we see any problems with molybdenum. But I throw it in there for completeness. And this is the one, nickel. The only time nickel has been deficient is in the southeast with crepe molybdenum. And they discovered it as a deficiency. And its plant function is assimilation of urea nitrogen. So if you're using nitrate or ammonium, guess what? Don't need it, right? Because you're getting nitrogen assimilation through nitrate or ammonium. It's only when urea is there, and the only source of nitrogen. And that's where they found it. And that was in 1986, I think, which I think is amazing that we're that far along. And science, 100 years, and we're only discovering these deficiency symptoms. And I can tell you with regards to plant nutrition, is that a lot of fertilizers used to be used to grind up soil and throw them on the ground, and whatever the rocks had in them, they did it. Then we got really good, and we processed everything, and refined everything, and took out all the impurities. And so then we started running into these micronutrient deficiencies because we were taking out the impurities. And so a lot of these things were discovered later on as science progressed. The other thing that helped us understand plant nutrition as well as human nutrition is that it used to be we were only able to develop and measure things in parts per million. And then we went to parts per trillion. And now we're in parts per, what did they reach? I read it the other day. They had in the water, the parts per quadrillion or something. It's ridiculous. And guess what? They found all this stuff in the water. It just appeared out of nowhere. I'm like, right, it just happens that all this stuff appeared out of nowhere, all these horrible things. And I'm like, oh, come on, people. It's been there forever. We just didn't have the technology to detect it. And so, yeah, you know, it's like when I talk about iron deficiency, right? We realize that iron deficiency, iron is in the new growth, and that iron cannot reallocate from the old leaves to the new leaves. Well, it turns out when our technology and our science our tools got better, we found, yeah, there's a little bit of movement, but it doesn't matter. It's not physiologically enough, right? So what difference does it make whether we can detect a little bit of movement? If it's physiologically not occurring to suit the needs of the new growth, then it's deficient. So if you want to start cutting hairs, let's do it. So what was the other thing with these nutrients? But I think that's an important thing to remember, and I think we're going to start seeing that with human nutrition as well. And that's the end of that talk. So that's the end of that talk, and we're actually an hour ahead. So here's what we can do. We can start, and we can start working on what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, you know what the fertilizers are, you don't know what the fertilizers are, you know what the nutrients are, and now the second part of this talk is going to be about the types of fertilizers that we can use, how they work, and then we're going to talk about monitoring. So you have all this going on now. How do you work with your own system, and what can you do? And the objective of this afternoon is to help you troubleshoot in a very economical kind of way, and then if you don't get a resolution, then let's go ahead and go with more expensive things like tissue testing or what have you. But there are things you can do in-house that will help you mitigate and figure out what's going on. And then there are things that you should probably just send out because it's just a little beyond the means of most of us. So do we want to start with the second one? Yes, we can. So you can take a break because I'm going to upload the next talk.